Imagine stepping into a centuries-old monastery, nestled deep within the mist-laden hills of Avalon, where the scent of damp earth and ancient stone merges with something far stranger and far more intoxicating. At once, you're struck by quiet, the type that blankets the world at midnight, where every breath seems to echo. Outside, fog coils around twisted oaks. Inside, candles cast uncanny shapes on walls, lined with parchments and brewing cauldrons. It is in this hush that Aldric exists, a young monk with eyes too restless for silence, a heart too hungry for purpose. From the very first line, you feel it. This isn't just another history story, it's a descent. You can almost taste the tensions. Something forbidden lurks among the monastery's fragrant walls. One night, Aldric discovers something that shatters the veneer of his orderly world. A hidden vine-cloaked clearing. A single plant, small yet defiant, with jagged violet leaves shimmering under moonlight. Locals whisper of Angel's Mercy, a name both comforting and ominous. It's called Henleaf and it's rumored to reveal the ineffable. As soon as Aldric plucks the leaves, you lean in. What happens next demands to be heard. He returns to his lonely cell, boils the leaves in mulled wine, and breathes deeply as the aroma curls around him, haunting, sweet, sacred. You can feel your pulse quicken. When he sips, the world shifts. Time slows, breath deepens, and every heartbeat feels like a toll of an ancient bell. Darkness becomes a canvas for silent visions. You glimpse dancing lights, hear murmured languages, and sense truths buried beyond scripture. Your skin pricks. This is beyond medicine or miracle. It electrifies the soul. Your mind races. Did that really happen? Is Aldric losing his faith or discovering a higher one? You want to know? You ache with curiosity. Because right here, at this precise moment, your expectations are subverted. Getting high is no modern vice, but a medieval conduit to the divine, and you're trapped, spellbound by the question, just how far could he go? Only now, dozens of centuries later, do we even begin to grasp what Aldric felt. Was this mystical truth, chemical illusion, or both? What he sipped wasn't cocaine or LSD. It wasn't for escape. It was for transformation. In a world without clocks, without distraction, without coffee or Prozac, this herb offered stillness and echo of eternity. He didn't stumble. He inhaled clarity. He tasted God, or the memory of something like it's something raw, delicate. IRRECOVERABLE. His use of Henleaf wasn't reckless. It was ritual, a sacred threshold crossed with quiet reverence. He drank under moonlight, in solitude, with prayers echoing in his mind like faint hymns. He never spoke of hallucinations. He spoke of light, understanding, mercy. He called it divine clarity, and after, he did not fall asleep. He woke. His vision sharpened. His faith, paradoxically, deepened. Our world today is loud. We chase novelty with pills, screens, noise. We fear stillness. Yet centuries ago, monks like Aldric embraced quiet and, through a simple leaf, touched something vast. Their intention wasn't to escape, it was to awaken. To feel the boundary between body and soul dissolve. So if you're wondering what getting high truly meant in medieval times, this isn't about parties, or smoke-filled rooms, or reckless abandon. It's about whispered secret gardens, vaulted stone, and a faith tempered by curiosity. It's about a moment when a single sip could open a universe. And if Aldric was on the edge of that universe, so are you now, listening, wondering, wanting to see how the story ends. Because he isn't the only one. There were other seekers, mystics, herbalists, who used plants to traverse the unseen. Their stories flicker through time like candlelight on cold stone, and each one asks the same question. What if what we need isn't louder, it's quieter? What if the path to truth lies not in escape, but in stillness? What mysteries linger just beyond the edge of our senses? If you feel that pull, that shimmer of curiosity, then you're ready. Ready to walk the path Aldric walked. Ready to follow the scent of Henleaf beyond the walls of Avalon. Ready to dive deeper into this hidden history where faith trembles on the edge of nature, and a simple sip can change everything. If you want more of these midnight tales of secret gardens, ancient brews, and moments that crack open reality, hit that subscribe button. Join us here. We're not just telling history, we're reviving the hush, the wonder, the possibility. Your subscription is more than support, it's an invitation. Because we're only just beginning. Now here's something fun. I want to hear what you think Aldric experienced. Was it genuine divine vision or a medicinal hallucination? Let me know in the comments. Quiz time. What do you believe Aldric experienced when he drank the Henleaf tea? A. Genuine spiritual vision that brought him closer to the divine. B. Natural, chemical induced state that his mind interpreted as sacred. Comment A or B. Below. Can't wait to see what you think. In the golden belly of Provence, where the land stretches like a whispered lullaby between lavender fields and ancient vineyards, there lived a woman who remembered what most had forgotten. Her name was Jezebel. The villagers called her a healer, a wise woman, sometimes a witch, but only when they were afraid of what they didn't understand. The truth, however, was far quieter and more complicated. Jezebel was a keeper of emotion, a curator of feeling, someone who knew how to bring the hidden to light without ever raising her voice. Her vineyard was nothing like the grand estates with gates and shining bottles. It was wild and winding, as though the vines themselves had grown with memory, curling around old stone and clinging to whispers left in the wind. No one walked through her fields without slowing down. Something about the place made your breath deepen, your shoulders lower, your thoughts soften. It was like stepping out of time. Every autumn, as the grapes ripened and the air took on that first chill of approaching dusk, Jezebel prepared something she called cur de vintha, heart of the vine. It wasn't just wine. It was a kind of invocation. She would steep the fermented grapes with damiana, dried fig skins, wild fennel, elderflower, and the petals of a rose that only bloomed once a year beneath the harvest moon. No one but Jezebel knew exactly what went into the brew. It was a recipe, passed down through silence, from one hand to the next. She never advertised. There were no signs, no announcements. And yet, every year, people arrived. Some traveled from other villages, some from as far away as Marseille or Lyon. They came, not as tourists or partygoers, but as pilgrims. They came with something inside them, something unspoken, grief, longing, memory, regret. Many couldn't even name what they were hoping to find. They just knew that something was missing, and that Jezebel's gathering, the feast of the vines, breath, might help them remember where it had gone. On the night of the gathering, the vineyard lit up with hundreds of candles each, one placed by hand, lining the rows of grapes like fireflies at rest. Musicians played, but no one danced, not yet. The music was soft, the kind of melody that you didn't just hear but felt, like the echo of a lullaby you thought you'd forgotten. People sat in small circles or alone. Some wept quietly before even tasting the wine Jezebel would pass through. The crowd with a clay pitcher, pouring just a small measure of the cur de vin into tiny cups. No more than 2 sips. That was all it ever took. And when people drank, something began to stir. Some saw faces they hadn't seen in decades, mothers long gone, lovers whose names still lived inside them. Others found themselves smelling the warm spice of a childhood kitchen, or hearing a voice that used to calm them in the night. It wasn't a drugged haze. It wasn't intoxication. It was clarity, sharpened by memory and softened by time. The wine didn't transport you somewhere new. It brought you back. Not to the grand events, but to the small, sacred ones. The sound of rain on a roof while you held someone you loved. The feeling of laughter when you thought you had forgotten how to do it. The scent of someone's hair. In the moment you realized you would never see them again. People didn't talk much during the experience. The vineyard held a hush, like a chapel without walls. Every so often, someone would place a hand on another's shoulder, a gesture that said, "I remember too." And then, just before dawn, Jezebel would rise and walk slowly into the vines, barefoot, her skirt trailing dew. The others would follow. They called it treading the sky. Each step was deliberate, each breath deep. The ritual was silent. There were no words that could explain what they had felt. The walk was the only language they had left. What the heart of the vine offered wasn't comfort. Not exactly. It was permission. Permission to feel everything. Permission to remember without collapsing. Permission to grieve with grace. It stripped away the armor most had forgotten they were wearing and left only the honest, quiet ache of being alive. Some people never came back. Not because they didn't want to, but because once was enough. Others returned every year, each time unraveling a new thread of the tapestry inside them. Jezebel never judged. She never asked questions. She just poured and listened, and offered her vineyard as a vessel for remembering. And then one year, she didn't appear. They say she passed quietly, beneath the very vines she had loved. Her granddaughter, Sarah, continued the tradition, though she never tried to replicate her grandmother's wine. Instead, she created her own, with new herbs, new notes, but the same sacred intention. The gathering continued, and people still came. Because what Jezebel had created wasn't just a recipe. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a reminder. In a world obsessed with spectacle, it's easy to forget that the deepest transformations often happen in silence. That sometimes, 2 sips of wine under a harvest moon can do more than years of forgetting. That getting high, in a time like Jezebel's, meant getting close not to oblivion, but to the most hidden, holy parts of yourself. So if you ever find yourself in Provence, and the air smells of fennel and candle wax, and your chest feels suddenly heavy with something you can't name, you might already be walking the path to Jezebel's vineyard. And if you find it, and someone offers you a tiny cup of something dark and shimmering, know this: you're not being invited to escape. You're being invited to remember. Along the shimmering edge of Lake Como, where the water catches the sun like polished silver, and every stone seems to carry the memory of something sacred, there stood a tree that didn't belong to any map. It leaned, gracefully bent, over the lake like a sentinel of dreams. Its roots reached deep beneath the soil and deep into stories no one remembered, clearly except one. Her name was Nona. To outsiders, she was the old woman who lived by the willow. To those in the nearby village, she was a remnant of a gentler time, a healer, a dream guide, a guardian of lost sleep. She wore wool shawls, the color of dusk, and her hair, long and white, flowed like the mist over the water every morning. Children feared her at first, adults respected her, but all of them, in some quiet way, needed her. Because Nona held something they had lost, the power to sleep without fear. She lived in a stone cottage that hugged the shoreline like it had been there forever. No signs, no path. You found it only when you needed it, when your nights were no longer your own, when dreams turned to weight, when rest refused to come, or when grief whispered too loudly in the dark. People came to Nona, and she welcomed them with no questions, only warm tea, soft words, and a ritual that felt older than language. Her most sacred creation was a brew called mandrava. It came from the root of a plant that grew only beneath the willow's shadow, knotted and gnarled, like it had twisted around every dream it had absorbed. It wasn't a route you pulled. It was one you asked permission to harvest. Nona spoke to it softly, sang to it as she dug, as if coaxing memory from the earth. Boiled slowly with valerian, petals of midnight bloom, and just a touch of lake water. Gathered before dawn, the mandrava tea shimmered with a strange light. Not a glow, not a color, a feeling. It felt like being held, even before you drank it. And when you did, the world didn't disappear, it softened. People didn't hallucinate with they remembered. But not like waking memory. This was deeper. You remembered in your body, in your breath. You remembered how it felt to be safe in your mother's arms. You remembered the quiet of a summer night, when your only fear was that it would end. You remembered someone saying your name with love. One man came to Nona after losing his wife. He had not slept in weeks, haunted not by what he'd seen, but by what he hadn't said. He drank mandrava in silence, lying beneath the willow as the lake exhaled its mist across his chest. That night, he didn't see his wife. He felt her, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she used to brush her fingers along his jaw. When he awoke, he didn't speak. He just wept, not from sadness, but from the sweetness of having touched her again. Even briefly, a child once arrived, brought by a desperate father. She hadn't spoken in months since her mother died. Nona gave her a single sip of mandrava and held her through the night. By morning, the child looked at the lake and whispered a song no one had taught her, a lullaby only her mother had known. The father fell to his knees, and always, Nona would say the same thing afterward. The dreams know the way. You just have to listen. Nona didn't call herself a healer. She didn't claim magic or miracle. What she offered was more intimate than that. She gave people back the pieces of themselves that the world had worn down. She helped them sleep, not just to rest, but to heal, to remember, to be held again in the arms of memory. The willow under which she brewed her tea became more than a tree. It became a threshold. The villagers began leaving offerings at its roots, tiny carvings, dried flowers, handwritten notes. They came not just for themselves, but for those they loved. For those who couldn't find their way to Nona. They believed, somehow, that the tree remembered too when Nona passed. It was a morning of still wind and glassy water. The birds didn't sing. The lake didn't stir. She was found beneath the willow, wrapped in her shawl, smiling as if mid-conversation with someone she had longed to see. They say the tree grew a new branch that week, curving upward toward the sky like a hand reaching for a hand already waiting. Her cottage remains, though no one lives in it now. The mandrava still grows, stubborn and sacred, and every year, on the anniversary of her passing, the villagers gather under the tree. They bring tea, they sing softly, and then they sleep not because they're tired, but because they wish to dream. They dream of those they've lost, of laughter that echoed, once in kitchens, long silent, of forgiveness, of beginnings they never had the courage to start. Nona's legacy wasn't in the herbs. It wasn't even in the dreams. It was in the quiet permission she gave the world to feel everything, fully and without shame. So if you ever walk the shores of Lake Como, and the mist thickens just a bit too quickly, and you smell something warm and ancient in the air, you may already be near the willow. And if you lie beneath it, if you close your eyes and listen gently, you might just find that someone's waiting for you on the other side of sleep. High in the mist-drenched hills of the Carpathians, where the trees breathe ancient secrets and the moon drips silver across the rooftops, there was a village that seemed to hold its breath. At night, the wind wound between the chimneys like a forgotten chant, and the shadows of pines danced along the narrow roads like silent watchers. Outsiders rarely came here, and those who did, especially the curious ones, the seekers, the skeptics, never left the same. Marin was one of them. She was a scholar, a traveler, a collector of stories. Her journal brimmed with notes and half-finished thoughts about forgotten traditions, healing herbs, the thin places where faith and magic blurred. But what she sought now wasn't just information, it was understanding. She'd heard the rumors in towns further west, whispers about a woman in the Carpathians who could help people fly. Not with wings, not with machines, but with something. Older, stranger, sacred, a salve, a ride, a rite. Locals spoke of her cautiously, eyes flicking to corners, as if the trees might be listening. They called her Illyra, and they didn't speak her name twice in one conversation. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she was a healer, a midwife to the soul. Whatever she was, she lived alone, near the edge of the forest, in a house no one admitted visiting, though many had. Always in secret, always after dark. Marin found her after 3 nights of searching, following a trail of blue flowers that bloomed only in moonlight, and a crow with one white wing that seemed to know the way. The house was older than it should have been built, of bone-colored stone and thatched with moss thick as wool. Smoke curled from its chimney like breath in cold air, slow and steady. Illyra opened the door before Marin knocked. Her hair was a river of gray, unbound, her eyes sharp as flint. She said nothing at first, only stepped aside to let Marin in, like she'd been expected for longer than either of them could name. Inside, it smelled of pine resin, dried petals, earth after rain. Herbs hung from beams in careful bundles, and bowls of crushed root and bark sat near a fire that hissed softly, like it too held a secret. Illyra didn't ask why Marin had come. She simply poured tea bitter. Warming Anne sat beside her. "You want the salve?" she said, not as a question, but as a truth already written. "But you don't know why." Marin opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have the words, yet only the hunger. The ache of not knowing what she had lost, or how to reclaim it. Illyra nodded. "It's not a shortcut, it's a door. You choose whether to walk through." That night, the ritual began. Illyra brought out a small pot sealed with beeswax and wrapped in red cloth. It was older than it looked. Inside was a thick ointment, deep green, nearly black, with a scent that shifted as you breathed it in, sharp, then sweet, then like damp soil and starlight. She explained what was in it, not with exact recipes, but with reverence. Henbane, for sight beyond sight. Belladonna, for breaking the border between breath and memory. Mandrake, for grounding the soul before its flight. And fat from a wild boar, killed under the waning moon, to bind the spirits into the body, even as it left it. "This is not for fun," Illyra warned. "Not for play. You'll leave yourself, and you'll meet what waits in the dark." Marin nodded. She was afraid, but she was more afraid of not knowing what she might become if she never dared. They stripped to bare skin and stood in the circle of stones outside. Beneath the full moon, Illyra whispered over the salve, then applied it with her fingers, gently, to the soft places, inside the elbows, behind the knees, the temples, the breastbone. She moved like someone painting with prayer. When she was done, Marin felt the cold, first, then the warmth, then nothing, and then everything. It began not with visions, but with sensation. Her heartbeat slowed, her skin tingled. The trees seemed to sway, not with the wind, but with breath. The stars above stretched, spun, pulled closer. Her body dissolved not into pain or pleasure, but into a kind of shimmering awareness. She was weightless, and then she was gone. She flew, not like a bird, not with wings, but with memory. She moved, through her own life like wind, through open windows. She saw herself at 5, watching snow fall for the first time. She saw her mother, long dead, humming as she stitched a hem by candlelight. She saw the ache in her own eyes the day she left. Her homeland, and the strength in her spine she hadn't known was there. She flew through all of it, fear, joy, heartbreak, birth, forgetting, and then beyond, she saw what came before. The women who had used the salve centuries ago, the hands that had stirred it, the prayers that had been whispered into its mix, midwives who had helped the dying cross gently into the next world, lovers who'd anointed each other and flown together, the persecuted, the hunted, the seekers, all who had dared to leave their bodies, not to escape, but to remember who they were before the world told them to forget. When Maren returned, hours later, or perhaps centuries, she was lying beside the fire, wrapped in wool and sweat. Illyra sat watching her, eyes soft now, like she knew the places Maren had been. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Illyra said, "You flew well." Maren nodded. She wept then, not from pain, but from the echo of her soul settling back into place. She hadn't just seen, she had understood. Her fears were not gone, but they no longer ruled her. She carried something now, a knowing, a gentleness. Before she left, Illyra pressed a pot of salve into her hand. "You'll know when to use it, but never to forget, only to remember." Maren traveled on, journal heavier with words that came like breath. She would never speak of the flight in full. It wasn't meant to be told, only felt. But she taught others not the recipe, but the reverence, not the ingredients, but the intention. And somewhere, beneath a Carpathian moon, the salve still waits, not as a trick, not as an escape, but as a passage for those brave enough to leave not the world, but the limits they've mistaken for home. Perched high above the Atlantic, on the rugged cliffs of Galicia, there was a monastery where the wind seemed to speak in tongues, where the sea mist curled like incense through cloisters, and the stones beneath your feet felt older than memory. It was not grand by medieval standards, no jeweled relics, no towering spires, but it was sacred in a quieter way. Its sanctity lived not in its altars, but in its gardens. And at the center of those gardens, something extraordinary was happening. The monks who lived there were not seekers of glory. They were seekers of stillness. Men who had once known war, grief, confusion, and chose instead to tend soil in silence. Among them was Lucan, a novitiate no older than 25, with dark, thoughtful eyes and hands that still bore the calluses of another life. He rarely spoke, but he listened deeply to the wind, the water, the plants. It was Lucan who first began to notice that the garden held more than herbs. It began with a plant he found growing beneath the shade of an old stone arch. One the other monks had long ignored. Its leaves were almost black, veined in silver, and when brushed, it released a scent like nothing Lucan had ever known. Sharp and soft, like the memory of a place you'd never been. He asked Father Illyrio, the elder in charge of the gardens, what it was. The old monk paused, then whispered a name Lucan had never heard before Nightvale. "It was once used in the deep rites," Illyrio said, voice low. "Not for the body, for the soul." Nightvale was not part of the daily teas or salves the monks prepared for the village. It was reserved for something far older, something the newer generations had all but forgotten, a ceremony called the contemplation of light. It was said that when combined with two other plants, mindshade blossom and breathrutan steeped under the waxing moon, Nightvale created a state of deep inner vision, a vision not outward, but inward, a mirror, not a window. Lucan asked to try it, not out of arrogance, but because there was something inside, him tight, locked, aching to be understood. Illyrio hesitated, then agreed, but only if Lucan would do it in the sanctuary, the garden of shadows and light. This garden was not open to the public. Hidden behind ivy-covered walls, it was planted in perfect symmetry, but wild within that order. Tall reeds bent in spiral patterns. Lavender grew beside black poppies. Stones were carved, not with words but with symbols: moons, hands, eyes, flames. In the center stood a marble basin, not for water, but for fire. On the night of the rite, Lucan prepared the infusion as instructed. He lit a small flame in the basin and sat cross-legged beside it. The tea was bitter, metallic, alive. He drank, closed his eyes, and waited. The silence stretched, then the world shifted. He did not see visions, not like paintings in the dark. He felt them. His breath became louder than thought. His heart became a drumbeat, echoing from somewhere far away, and then suddenly, very close. He felt as though he were falling not into fear, but into space, into self, into something vast and echoing and holy. Memories returned, but not like film, like wind. His mother's laugh on a summer afternoon, the chill of the sea, the day his brother drowned, his own screams, silent in the arms of a priest who didn't know what else to do. The years of quiet afterward, the nights he could not sleep, the ache that prayer could not touch. He wept not from grief, but from the fullness of it, from feeling it all at once, without resistance, without shame. For the first time, Lucan understood that healing was not forgetting. It was remembering, with open arms. When he came back, the fire was still burning, but the night had deepened. The stars seemed closer. Ilario sat beside him silently. No words were exchanged. None were needed. From that night forward, Lucan tended the garden of shadows and light, as if it were a temple. He invited others, quietly, when he sensed the weight in their shoulders or the tremble in their voices. Not everyone was ready. Not everyone came back the same. But no one came back untouched. Word began to spread. Pilgrims arrived from distant corners, not for relics or miracles, but for this quiet. Right? The monks never advertised. They simply allowed. Those who needed it found their way. The garden began to evolve. Plants not native to Galicia began to grow. They're brought by travelers, perhaps, or drawn by the energy itself. A vine from the east that bloomed only at night. A moss that changed color depending on where you stepped. Every plant seemed to hold a different tone of truth. Lucan began writing not sermons, but reflections, observations. He never gave advice, only questions. What are you hiding from? What part of you have you buried in order to survive? What would happen if you called it back? His writings never left the monastery, but they lived on in the way the monks spoke to one another, in the way they paused before plucking a leaf, in the way they looked each other in the eye. Years later, when Lucan was old and nearly blind, he sat once more in the garden, now wild with decades of reverent growth. A young monk asked him what he had seen that night, what he had learned. Lucan smiled and placed a hand on the soil beside him. That it was never about seeing, he said. It was about remembering that I was never separate from any of it. Not the pain, not the light, not even the shadow. And with that, he leaned back, eyes closed, and listened to the wind, no longer searching, but simply part of it. The garden of shadows and light still stands today, tended by hands that understand reverence, not control. It does not promise healing. It offers reflection, a space to meet yourself beneath the skin of the world. Because sometimes, the only way to truly move forward is to sit in stillness long enough to feel what's already inside and to allow it, finally, to bloom. In the labyrinthine heart of Bruges, where the canals run like quiet veins through stone and shadow, there was a house known not for its grandeur, but for its grace. Tucked behind a low, ivy-covered wall, on a street too narrow for carts, it wore its age proudly. Wood beams darkened by centuries, shutters painted a red long faded by rain and time. To most, it was invisible. But to those who needed it most, it seemed to appear exactly when it was supposed to. They called it the House of Healing Echoes. It was run by a woman named Mira, whose presence seemed to blur the line between caregiver and spirit. She was neither nun nor noble, not tied to any abbey or physician's guild. She lived simply, in soft linens and quiet footsteps, with hair always tied back and hands that smelled of lavender, clove, and sometimes something more mysterious. No one remembered when she arrived in Bruges, but everyone remembered what she gave them, a kind of healing no one else could name. Her house was not a place of miracles. There were no grand pronouncements, no loud weeping, no banners of faith. There was tea, always warm, blankets that smelled of sun and chamomile, and a silence that seemed to listen more deeply than most people ever could. The hearth was always lit. The air always tasted faintly of honeyed bark and mint. It felt, more than anything, like being allowed to breathe again after a long time underwater. Mira's most treasured preparation was a tonic, known only by its nickname Veil wine. It was not wine at all, but a thick infusion brewed with red poppy petals, aged fig bark, willow resin, and the oil of a flower that only bloomed at dusk along the canal's edge. The result was deep, red as garnet, and subtly like memory, then medicine. Mira brewed it slowly, always at dawn, humming as she stirred, as if reminding the mixture why it had come into being. Veil wine was not administered to all, only those who could not speak their pain aloud. The ones for whom grief had grown so vast, so tangled, that language failed. It did not cure, it did not erase, but it softened. It peeled back the layers of defense, of shock, of hardness that life had demanded, and let the soul move again. Aldric was one such soul. He arrived one late winter evening, hunched against the cold, face gray from wounds, not just of war, but of the mind. A soldier once, now barely a man. He had refused the care of physicians, had fled when faced with the clatter of tools and the promise of pain. Mira said nothing when he arrived. She only brought him in, removed his boots, wrapped him in wool, and placed a steaming cup in his hands. The first sip was like exhale, the second, like remembering. He spoke not of battles, but of silence, of how it felt to hear nothing but his own heartbeat in the days after the last attack, of his brother, lost not in war, but in the space between decisions. Mira listened, not to reply but to witness, and when he wept, she let him. The next morning, she cleaned his wounds. He allowed her eyes open, breath steady. Afterward, he looked around the little room, touched the edge of the teacup still warm beside him, and said softly, "I thought healing would be louder than this." Mira smiled. Most people do. Children came too. Quiet ones, pale ones, ones whose parents had no answers left. Mira met them with songs made of hums and hands that folded herbs into tiny sachets they could carry with them, tucked beneath pillows, hold in their small, shaking fists. One girl, no older than 8, arrived, without speech. Her mother said she hadn't spoken since her brother had drowned the year before. Mira gave her a sachet filled with marjoram, wild mint, and 3 tiers of resin from a tree that grew near the graveyard. That night, the girl sang in her sleep. Not all who came left healed. Some died there, but not alone, and not afraid. Mira sat with them, offering the veil wine in small sips, not to numb, but to allow one last journey inward. Many passed with a smile, lips whispering names or prayers, or nothing at all, because even silence was sacred in Mira's house. What made the House of Healing, Echoes special, was not just Mira or the brews she made. It was the permission it gave, to grieve, to pause, to be held, if only briefly, in the arms of something that did not demand answers or progress. Something that simply said, "You are allowed to feel this." Mira never called herself a healer. When asked, she'd say she was a listener. That the body will often tell you how to heal, if you make the space for it. That pain, if acknowledged, does not have to be fought. It can be softened, held, transformed. The house changed with the seasons. In spring, violets bloomed beneath its windows. In summer, the canal's scent slipped through the shutters. In winter, Mira hung dried orange slices over the fireplace. No matter the month, people found their way to her door. They left small tokens in return: pressed flowers, carved stones, scraps of poetry. She accepted them all with the same small nod, as if collecting echoes of the people she had helped remember themselves when she died. The city mourned not with bells, but with silence. Her door was left ajar for 3 days, and visitors came to leave herbs, letters, and folded paper boats in the canal. The house, now empty of breath, but still full of memory, seemed to sigh in gratitude. No one has taken her place. Not exactly, but the house remains, kept up by quiet hands. And sometimes, when the air shifts just right, when you feel something in your chest loosen and rise for no reason at all, you know the echoes are still there, waiting, healing, whispering that you are not broken, only bending toward something new, because healing does not always shout. Sometimes, it arrives in the softest place, in the warmth of a room where someone sees you, offers you a cup of something sacred, and says nothing at all. High in the lush green folds of the Pontic Mountains, where the cliffs look down on the Black Sea with a kind of patient wonder, there is a place where the air itself seems thicker with memory. Here, in the winding paths above Rise, bees have lived undisturbed for centuries, weaving their lives between wild rhododendrons and the scattered gardens of solitary shepherds. The honey they make is rare, dark, potent, and for those who taste it, it can open more than just the senses, it can open the spirit. Mira had never intended to travel so far east, but after the death of her mentor, she felt something in her soul loosen, like a knot untying from the inside. She closed the house of healing echoes for a season, locking the doors not with finality, but with the quiet reverence of someone who understands when it is time to listen rather than act. Word had reached her through the herbalist's network. Crypt notes whispered rumors about a woman living alone in the mountains of Rise, who worked not with tinctures or teas, but with honey that sang to the wind. Mira had learned by now to pay attention to language like that. The journey was not easy. The roads became footpaths, and the footpaths became trails only goats seemed to know. She walked for days with little company beyond birds and the low rush of wind through pine. When she finally found the cottage, if one could call it that, it looked as if the mountain itself had grown it. Stone half sunken into the hillside, vines braided over the roof, and beehives stacked like ancient altars beneath the eaves. The woman who emerged to greet her was called Elon. Her face bore the same ageless quality Mira had seen in many healers, lined, yes, but with eyes that held more life than time. She didn't ask why Mira had come. She simply handed her a small piece of dark bread, soaked in a drizzle of honey, so rich it glowed like amber caught in shadow. Mira tasted it, and the world paused. The flavor was unlike anything she had known, floral, earthy, electric. But it wasn't the taste that stunned her. It was the sudden rush of sensation that followed, a childhood memory she hadn't thought of in decades. The sound of laughter in a long-forgotten garden, the feeling of lying in grass while clouds moved, like slow wails overhead. It wasn't just memory. It was music, a resonance inside her chest, like someone humming from within. That's the red honey, Elin said, matter of fact, mad honey, some call it. The bees make it from a particular flower, one that grows only for a few weeks in the spring. It's not for every day. It's for when you're ready to remember who you were before the forgetting. Elon used the honey not as medicine, but as invitation. She would mix it with crushed herbs and warm goat's milk, or swirl it into tea made from foraged herbs that bloomed only at night. She did not dose people. She guided them, and those who came to her did not come to be cured. They came to be unraveled. One evening, Mira watched as a musician arrived, disheveled, hollow-eyed, carrying a lute he hadn't touched in months. He was lost, he said, not in direction, but in voice. He couldn't remember why he had ever sung. Elin gave him a cup of honeyed infusion and told him to sit beside the wind, nothing more, and so he did. As twilight slipped in, he closed his eyes, his breathing slowed, and then, without warning, his hands moved, fingers tracing old chords. A hum escaped his lips, not a song, not yet, but a sound so raw, it trembled the air. Mira listened, goosebumps rising along her arms. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was truer than that. It was like the mountain had opened its throat and let him borrow its voice. Elin believed that the honey was a key, not a key to revelation, but to resonance. "Everyone has a note," she said once to Mira. "A tone that belongs only to them. The honey doesn't create it. It clears the dust so you can hear it again." Mira began to understand that this was not about visions or euphoria. It was about calibration, like tuning an old instrument, letting it remember what it was made to sing. People came not for escape, but for return, to their art, to their emotion, to the places inside them they had silenced out of fear, or practicality, or survival. One night, under a sky littered with stars, Elin offered Myra a full measure of the red honey undiluted raw. Myra accepted. She sat beside the cliff, overlooking the sea, and let the warmth slide through her. What followed was not hallucination. It was poetry. She felt every sorrow she had ever held, not as weight, but as color. The gray of her father's silence, the indigo of a patient's final breath, the red of her first heartbreak, and alongside them, the colors of joy she'd buried because they hurt too much to hold. Gold for the laugh of a child she'd once saved, emerald for the grass she'd lain in after her first healing, silver for every moment of awe that had moved through her like song. And then she heard it faint like wind through reed but real, her own note, her own hum. It was not pretty, not melodic, but it was hers, and it had never left. She wept, then laughed, then sat in silence, hands pressed to the earth, eyes closed, listening. For the first time in years, she didn't want to fix anything. She just wanted to be dot. In the morning, Elin gave her a small vial of honey, sealed with wax and marked only with a single thread of silver. "You'll know when to open it," she said, "when your voice forgets again." Mira left not with answers, but with presence, and when she reopened the House of Healing Echoes months later, she sang as she stirred her teas, not loudly, not perfectly, but with truth. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the city in just the right way, you can hear it hum so soft it could be missed, unless you're listening not with your ears, but with your soul. A hum that reminds you, the song was never gone. It was just waiting to be sung again. In a remote valley tucked beneath the emerald ridges of the Julian Alps, there was a village forgotten by maps and remembered only by myth. The locals called it Villenge, though few said the name aloud, as if it might vanish the moment it was spoken. It wasn't that the village was magical in the fantastical sense. There were no dragons or spells, but there was something different here, something that moved just beneath the surface of ordinary life. A rhythm, a pulse, a forgotten song that lingered in the soil and the bones of its people. It was here that Mira arrived, older now, slower in her stride but deeper in her seeing. She had followed not a person or a message this time, but a dream. One that came again and again, always the same. A woman kneading dough in a quiet kitchen, her hands moving with a grace that made the flour seem to shimmer, and somewhere in the background, faint music, the kind that made your chest ache, even if you couldn't remember why. The villagers greeted her with the familiar caution of those who have learned not to trust easily, yet recognized something in her gaze, something ancient, gentle, necessary. They led her to the house she had seen in her dreams, a small stone cottage with wooden shutters and an oven that seemed to breathe warmth even when no fire burned within. Inside lived Ilka, a baker who was nearing 70, with arms strong from decades of kneading and eyes that had watched more seasons change than most dared count. Ilka didn't ask who Mira was. She simply handed her a small piece of bread, dense and golden, with a scent like roasted chestnuts and honey. Mira took a bite and stopped breathing for just a moment. It wasn't the taste that stunned her. It was what rose within her. Memory of movement, of bare feet on wood floors, of spinning in slow circles to music that no longer had a name. Tears welled in her eyes without warning. Ilka nodded, unsurprised. "That's the bread of the forgotten dance," she said quietly. "It doesn't feed the body. It feeds what the body is hidden." Ilka explained that long ago, the villagers had a tradition, an annual dance held at the end of harvest, when the final loaves of the season were baked, not for sustenance, but for memory. These loaves were mixed with wild grains, crushed roots, and an herb called salvine that grew only in the shadow of the tallest mountain. Salvine was no ordinary plant. It was bitter to the tongue, but when fermented in dough, it awakened something else entirely. A softness of mind, a looseness of limbs. The memories stored in the body itself began to rise, like dough in warm air, when eaten on the night of the forgotten dance. The bread allowed villagers to remember, not with their heads, but with their bodies. Elders recalled loves they had once, thought buried. Children danced, as though guided by music, older than language, and the griefs that had stiffened in joints and muscles seemed to melt, released not in words, but in motion. But over time, as war and hardship took their toll, the dance stopped. The bread was baked less often, and when the elders who knew the rhythm of that old music died, the village fell silent. Only Ilka remained, and even she had not held the dance in over a decade. She still baked the bread once a month, always, at night, but she ate it alone. Myra stayed, not to teach, but to remember. She and Ilka baked together in the evenings, hands dusted in flour, sharing stories not with voices, but with movement, elbows brushing, palms folding, backs leaning in perfect counterbalance. Mira learned the recipe not through instruction, but through instinct. It was not written. It could not be. It had to be felt. One night, as the wind whispered through the valley and the stars blinked open like slow embers, Ilka turned to her and said, "It's time." They baked 12 loaves, each one shaped slightly differently, as if to represent a different kind of memory. They placed them on a long table beneath the old linden tree in the village square. Myra lit candles. Ilka brought out a box wrapped in silk, within which lay an instrument Myra didn't recognize, a kind of small lyre carved with runes. Ilka plucked a single note, and something shifted in the air. Villagers emerged slowly, drawn not by announcement but by recognition. Elders, in shawls. Children rubbing sleep from their eyes. Middle-aged men and women with furrowed brows that slowly softened as the music drifted through them. Ilka broke the first loaf and handed Mira a piece. Mira chewed slowly. The flavor was earthy, sharp, unfamiliar, and then her body began to sway, not wildly, not with abandon, but with memory. Her feet moved in small, circular motions. Her arms lifted like they had once done in some life she had forgotten. Others joined. Some laughed, others cried. No one spoke. The dance unfolded, like a story that had been waiting to be told. Young and old moved together, across the cobblestones and into the night, illuminated by firelight and the soft, pulsing hum of the lyre. The bread passed from hand to hand, and with each bite, more people remembered. Not events, but sensations. A first kiss under plum blossoms. The comfort of a father's arm. The weight of a loss finally released through breath. When the final note rang out, no one clapped. They simply stood in silence, eyes glistening, hearts beating a little more freely. The forgotten dance had returned, not as a spectacle, but as a salve. Myra knew then that her journey wasn't about finding new things to learn. It was about remembering the things her soul already knew. Through honey and herbs and tea and now bread, she had stitched herself back into a story, far older than any one life. She left the valley weeks later, but she took a bundle of salvine seeds with her, and in the small courtyard behind the House of Healing Echoes, she planted them beneath a linden tree of her own. Sometimes, when the city becomes too loud, When the grief in her patience runs too deep for words, she bakes, and she does not ask them to talk. She only places warm slices in their hands, turns on soft music, and waits for their bodies to remember. Because some stories do not need to be told, they only need to be danced. Beneath the snow-dusted peaks of the Tatra Mountains, where the wind hummed like an old hymn and the forests grew deep enough to forget your name, there was a root that never grew in the same place twice. Locals called it Zemiak Zalayo, the wicked potato, but those who truly knew it never used such names. To the healers who had passed its story from hand to trembling hand, it was simply the wandering root. It did not look like much, knotted, small, pale as bone, and often hidden beneath layers of moss and lichen. It grew only after the frost broke, and only in places where sorrow had once settled deeply into the land, a battlefield, a forgotten grave, the site of an old betrayal. It was as if the root sought out grief, not to feed on it, but to transform it. Mira had heard whispers of the root years before, when she was still tending the House of Healing Echoes. But it was only after her time in the village of Valenge, after the dance had ended and her hands ached from weeks of kneading memory into bread, that the dream returned. In it, she stood barefoot in a snow-laced forest, her hand brushing through soil until she found something small but pulsing. The next morning, she packed her bag and traveled east. She found the forest after days of walking, dark, quiet, expectant. There were no trails, only the soft impressions of deer and fox and something older. She moved without urgency, trusting her steps to something beyond reason. And on the third day, beneath a pine tree struck once by lightning and scarred but still alive, she found it, the root from her dream. When she touched it, her fingers tingled, not with pain, but with memory. She did not harvest it immediately. Instead, she knelt and stayed with it for a long while, listening not with her ears, but with her breath. The wandering root was never to be taken quickly. It required presence, reverence, a kind of conversation. When she finally unearthed it, she sang softly, a lullaby her mother had sung when Mira was still too small to know sorrow. Back at the small cabin she had borrowed from an old herbalist near Zakopane, Mira began the preparation. The root could not be boiled or dried. It had to be grated raw, then mixed with the juice of pine needles, the zest of wild lemon balm, and a few drops of oil from the rare white elder. The mixture had to rest for exactly 3 nights under a waning moon. On the 4th morning, it was ready. The tincture that resulted was faintly blue, with a scent like frost and citrus and something else, something forgotten. Myra took only a sip, and then, as always, she waited. What came was not a vision, it was a return. She found herself walking through every room she had ever entered, with sorrow in her chest. The hallway where her father said goodbye for the last time, the clinic, where a patient slipped away while she hummed, helpless. The bakery where a woman once confessed she couldn't forgive herself. These were not memories, they were visitations. And this time, Myra wasn't just an observer. She was present. She reached out. She listened. She forgave. The wandering root did not remove pain. It allowed her to sit beside it, unflinching. It gave her the strength to stay in the presence of what once felt unbearable, and to see, finally, that even sorrow could be tender. She stayed with the root's gift for hours, maybe longer. When she awoke, the fire had burned low, but the air felt clearer, as if the room itself had exhaled. Mira did not take the root with her when she left. She returned what she had not used to the earth, burying it gently beneath the same pine tree with a whisper of gratitude. That was the way of the wandering root. You did not own it. You visited it, and if you were lucky, it visited you back. Over the next year, Myra would speak only of the experience to those who truly needed it. To the man who couldn't grieve his child. To the woman who had been angry for so long she forgot what lay beneath it. She gave them no promises, No potions, only direction. A map sketched by memory. A handful of herbs to carry for grounding. A single line. Listen to the place the pain lives, and you might find what's been waiting to bloom beneath it. In time, Myra returned home. The house of healing echoes was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had just grown larger inside. She planted a new garden, not with the roots of rare plants, but with ordinary things. Thyme, chamomile, yarrow. She did not seek visions anymore. She taught others how to rest, how to weep, how to sit with silence and find that it too can be healing. And sometimes, when the wind shifted or the soil felt especially soft beneath her feet, she would pause and smile, because she knew the wandering root was still out there, not just in the forest, but in every place where sorrow lingered long enough to become soil, waiting for those brave enough to sit beside their pain, to drink from its bitter beauty, and to remember that even the deepest wounds, when met with tenderness, can become paths back to ourselves. In the stillness that comes after a story has ended, something remarkable begins. Not just silence, but reflection. And now, as we draw the final breath of Mira's journey, what lingers is not just the memory of what she did, but the weight of who she became, and what that means for us. Mira's path began, not with certainty, but with curiosity. She did not set out to become a healer, a guide, or a myth. She simply followed the pull of something inside her that refused to quiet her longing to remember. Not just facts or faces, but something deeper. The feeling of being whole, from the whispering herbs of Avalon to the honey that sang to the wind, from flying beneath the stars to kneeling beside a wandering root. Mira traveled not through fantasy, but through layers of her own humanity. Every chapter of her journey peeled away what she had been told to forget: grief, joy, intuition, tenderness, and gave it back to her, not as burdens, but as gifts. And through it all, what she discovered was this: healing is not an act of erasure. It is an embrace. It is not found in forgetting pain, but in learning to hold it without breaking. Not running from sorrow, but sitting beside it until it transforms. She met fear in the stillness. She met love in silence. She met memory not in the mind, but in the marrow. And at each stop, through each herb, each dance, each song, she came back more fully into herself. Not perfect, not unbroken, but beautifully alive. There was no final miracle. No triumphant climax, only presence, only practice. The slow, deliberate art of being with what is real, no matter how tender, no matter how painful. And in this, Mira didn't just become a healer, she became a mirror for everyone who crosses her path. So what do we take from this? In a world that moves too fast, praises productivity over peace, and asks us to numb more than to feel, Mira reminds us that the most radical thing we can do is to pause, to breathe, to feel, to ask not, how do I fix this, but what is this here to teach me? The herbs she touched, the teas she brewed, the dances she shared, these were not magic in the traditional sense. They were invitations. Invitations to come home to the parts of ourselves we've silenced. Invitations to grieve, to rejoice, to listen deeply to what lives beneath our busyness. And here's the lesson we can carry. Today, you do not need a mountaintop or a monastery to begin. You need only one thing: your willingness to listen, to your body, to your sadness, to your joy, to your story. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to escape yourself, and instead say, I'm here, I'm ready. So, I ask you now, which part of Myra's journey spoke to you the most and why? Was it the quiet courage of sitting with grief? The joy of remembering how to dance? The hum of truth in a cup of tea? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would truly love to hear what resonated with you most. Your voice matters here, and if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own forgotten song, your own need for stillness and connection, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's your support that gives us the strength and inspiration to create more stories that matter, that heal, and that stay with you long after the screen fades to black dot. Until next time, remember, the way back to yourself is never lost. It's only waiting for you to listen.